The deluge, when it came, was a shocking, brutal cold. A violent targeted spray that stole the breath from Lily's small 10-year-old frame, drenching her in an instant, pasting her party dress to her skin. Her joyous laughter, just moments before echoing like wind chimes across our sun-dappled lawn, choked into a terrified, sputtering gasp. The brightly colored ribbons, vibrant pinks and purples she'd chosen herself for her special birthday wheelchair decorations, were instantly plastered to the cool metal, dripping onto the already soaked festive fabric of her new dress. Her meticulously decorated cake, a whimsical fairy tale castle she'd dreamed of for weeks, sketched out in her art pad with painstaking care, sat on the nearby patio table. Its sugary turrets, once proud and colorful, now began to weep, melting under the relentless, misdirected, watery assault. Lily, who dreamed of becoming an artist, had designed it herself. I was just inside the patio door, the warmth of the kitchen at my back, reaching for a tray laden with freshly baked chocolate chip cookies, their aroma still clinging to the air. 1 second, our backyard was a sanctuary of childish delight, a vibrant tapestry, woven with the squeals and giggles of Lily's friends, gathered for her much-anticipated 10th birthday. The next, it exploded into a scene of chaos, disbelief, and a dawning, sickening horror, all dominated by the aggressive, malevolent hiss of a garden hose wielded with what could only be described as deliberate, focused malice. And holding that hose, her face a grotesque mask of grim, almost ecstatic satisfaction, was Karen Henderson, our neighbor, the self-appointed, overly zealous guardian of our homeowners association's nebulous, inconsistently applied, and ever-shifting standards of suburban propriety. Her eyes, cold, hard, and unnervingly steady, were fixed directly on Lily. Lily, who sat stunned, shivering her small, pale hands, gripping the arms of her wheelchair with a desperate strength, her face a canvas of shock, confusion, and a rapidly blooming fear. "What in the name of God are you doing?" The words ripped from my throat, raw, primal, and utterly furious, as I dropped the tray of cookies. The metallic clang of the tray hitting the stone patio was swallowed by the still gushing, relentless water. I sprinted across the lawn, my feet barely registering the damp grass, my heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs, a surge of protective maternal rage I hadn't felt in years, perhaps ever coursing through me like wildfire. Karen Henderson didn't flinch. Not even a flicker of surprise crossed her face. She simply tightened her grip on the hose nozzle, the water pressure remaining cruelly unwavering, still aimed at my child. "This is a clear violation," she shrieked, her voice piercing and shrill, somehow cutting through the sound of the relentless spray. "These decorations are excessive, utterly tasteless, and this gathering is creating a significant disturbance to the neighborhood." Lily's friends, a small bewildered group of 9 and 10-year-olds, had scattered like frightened birds. Their faces were a heartbreaking mixture of raw fear and utter bewilderment. Some were crying, openly huddled together near the back fence, as if seeking shelter from a storm, while others just stood frozen, paralyzed, staring at the unfolding nightmare, their party hats askew. My husband, Mark, who had been supervising a chaotic game of tag near the old oak tree at the far end of the yard, was already rushing towards Karen, his face a thundercloud of disbelief and rapidly escalating anger. "Turn it off, Karen. Turn the goddamn hose off now." Mark yelled, his voice a low, dangerous growl that promised retribution. She finally reluctantly relinquished her grip on the nozzle, letting the heavy hose fall to the saturated grass with a dull thud. The water, however, continued to gush, unchecked from the dropped end, rapidly creating a muddy, spreading puddle that was now inching perilously towards the party table, threatening the already damaged cake and the scattered presents. Karen's chest was heaving, her expression one of defiant, almost gleeful righteousness. "I have every right," she declared, her voice still shrill. "This is an HOA matter. There are rules. Rules that clearly none of you seem to respect." But my focus, my entire being, wasn't on Karen's pathetic justifications, not entirely. It was on Lily. My beautiful, brave, resilient Lily, who had faced more physical challenges and medical procedures in her 10 short years than most people face in an entire lifetime. Lily, whose infectious smile, even on her toughest days, could light up the darkest room, now sat shivering, uncontrollably soaked to the bone, her special birthday utterly irrevocably ruined by this inexplicable act of calculated adult cruelty. Her lower lip trembled violently, and a single large tear traced a path through the water, droplets still clinging to her pale cheek. The sight of that tear, that look of betrayed innocence, shattered something deep and fundamental inside me. I reached Lily first, falling to my knees beside her wheelchair, my hands shaking so badly I could barely function. I tried to shield her small, trembling body from the lingering misty spray and the cold afternoon breeze that suddenly felt biting and cruel against my own skin. "Oh, baby, I'm so sorry. Are you okay? Are you hurt?" My voice was thick, choked with unshed tears of rage and sorrow. I fumbled with the clasps of her safety belt, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline. She just nodded mutely at first, her wide, terrified eyes still fixed on Karen, who stood a few feet away glaring. A dawning, horrified understanding of the woman's sheer malice was clouding their innocent, usually bright depths. That look, that dawning comprehension of pure, unadulterated adult cruelty in her eyes, more than anything else, fueled the cold, hard, diamond-sharp anger that was rapidly solidifying within me, eclipsing the initial shock. She ruined my cake. Lily whispered, her voice barely audible, a tiny heartbroken sound that tore through me. The castle. My name is Sarah Jennings, and I am a county justice advocate. My entire professional career, my very calling, has been dedicated to fighting for the vulnerable, for those whose voices are too often silenced or ignored, for those who have been wronged, abused, or diminished by individuals, by corporations, by broken systems. I've navigated incredibly complex legal battles, faced down intimidating teams of high-powered corporate lawyers, and tirelessly advocated for systemic change to protect the powerless. But in that moment, standing in my ruined, waterlogged backyard with my precious child, traumatized, her birthday party in tatters, her spirit momentarily crushed, the professional advocate faded into the background. The mother, raw, elemental, and fiercely unconditionally protective, took complete and utter control. Karen Henderson, in her profound ignorance and arrogance, had absolutely no idea who or what she had just so foolishly provoked. The setup of our lives in this sleepy, seemingly idyllic suburban enclave had been until that dreadful afternoon, relatively peaceful, almost tranquil. We'd moved to Willow Creek Estates 3 years ago, drawn by the ubiquitous promises of good schools, quiet tree-lined streets, and that elusive, often illusory sense of community. Lily, who was born with a rare neuromuscular condition that confined her to a wheelchair and left her perpetually susceptible to dangerous respiratory infections, needed a stable, nurturing, and supportive environment above all else. Even a common cold could be perilous for her. For the most part, Willow Creek had seemed to provide that. Our immediate neighbors, the Parkers on one side and the Chungs on the other, were kind, thoughtful people. The kids in the cul-de-sac were generally welcoming and inclusive. Lily had made a few close friends. She was thriving academically in her mainstream classes with the help of a wonderful aide, and she adored our little house with its specially designed accessible garden where she could spend hours watching the butterflies flit among the flowers she'd helped Mark plant her sketchbook, always close at hand. She dreamed of illustrating children's books one day, books filled with magic and kindness. Karen Henderson, however, had always been a discordant, jarring note in this otherwise harmonious suburban symphony. She lived 2 houses down a widow in her late 50s with apparently far too much time on her hands and an almost pathological obsessive fixation with the HOA bylaws, or rather, her uniquely rigid and often self-serving interpretation of them. There had been minor skirmishes before, of course, a politely worded but undeniably firm note about the height of our sunflowers supposedly obstructing a view corridor, a view of what we never figured out. A formal complaint lodged with the HOA about Mark's car being parked too close to the curb for a few hours while he was unloading groceries. A passive-aggressive saccharine comment delivered over the fence about the rather enthusiastic noise level during a small family barbecue celebrating Mark's promotion. We'd largely dismissed them as the petty, irritating ramblings of a lonely, officious, and probably unhappy woman. Annoying, yes, but ultimately harmless. We had never not, in our wildest nightmares, imagined she was capable of such targeted personal and vicious cruelty, especially towards a child, towards my child on her birthday. The inciting incident, this deliberate drenching, this unprovoked act of naked aggression, was so much more than just a ruined birthday party. It felt like a declaration of war, a gauntlet thrown down with malicious intent. Karen had chosen her target with chilling precision, my disabled daughter, on her 10th birthday in front of her friends, and had executed her attack with a shocking, almost gleeful lack of empathy or basic human decency. As Mark finally managed to wrestle the still-spewing heavy hose away from the muddy patch of grass and forcefully turn off the spigot at the side of Karen's house, she stood her ground, her arms crossed defiantly over her chest, a smug, deeply unsettling little smirk playing on her lips. Well, someone had to do something definitive, she announced, her voice carrying clearly to the small, horrified audience of shivering children and a few bewildered parents who had just started to arrive for party pickup, their faces aghast at the scene. This entire spectacle was getting completely out of hand. This is a respectable residential area, not some tawdry carnival sideshow. One of the arriving mothers, Mrs. Davies, whose daughter Chloe was Lily's best friend, gasped audibly, "Karen, what on earth have you done?" Out of hand, I repeated, my voice dangerously low, almost a whisper, yet vibrating with a controlled fury as I rose slowly to my feet. I had managed to wrap a discarded, slightly damp tablecloth around Lily's shivering shoulders, a pathetic attempt at warmth. "You call a 10-year-old child's birthday party out of hand, Karen. You honestly think drenching a disabled girl with a freezing cold garden hose is an appropriate or even sane response to what balloons? She shouldn't be so delicate. Then should she if she can't handle a little bit of water?" Karen retorted, her eyes flicking dismissively, contemptuously towards Lily, who flinched as if struck. The casual cruelty of the remark was breathtaking, and those garish decorations are a clear, flagrant violation of Article 4, Section B, subsection 3 of the HOA Covenants. Excessive and unsightly public display of temporary fixtures. I have a highlighted copy in my house if you'd care to review it. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of her statement, the blatant, unashamed cruelty of her words, coupled with her pathetic, officious appeal to non-existent authority, left me momentarily speechless, struggling for breath. "A little water." Mark sputtered, his face flushed a deep, alarming crimson. He took a step towards Karen, his fists clenched, and I subtly put a restraining hand on his arm. "You aimed it directly at her, Karen. At her face." For several minutes, she soaked to the skin in freezing cold. "What is wrong with you?" She's also effectively blocking the common neighborhood view with all this paraphernalia. Karen sniffed disdainfully, gesturing vaguely with a wave of her hand at the deflated, waterlogged balloons and the sodden, drooping banner that read in Lily's favorite sparkly letters, "Happy 10th birthday. Lily." The banner now looked like a forgotten, tragic relic. The other parents were now murmuring amongst themselves, their initial shock rapidly morphing into visible disgust and anger. Mrs. Davies, Chloe's mother, a normally quiet and reserved woman, stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "Karen, this is absolutely appalling behavior. Lily was having a lovely quiet time with her friends. There was no disturbance whatsoever. We could barely hear them from the street." Another father, Mr. Chen, who had just arrived, added, "My son was so excited for this party. What you've done is... It's monstrous, Karen. Truly monstrous." Karen shot them both a withering glare. "That's your uninformed opinion. I am thinking of the overall property values. This kind of unregulated, excessive display, it brings the entire neighborhood down. It creates a precedent." The first stage of the rising action, the initial confrontation, began right there, fueled by Karen's utter chilling lack of remorse and her pathetic, transparently false attempts at justification. She wasn't just a meddling, officious neighbor with a rulebook fetish. She was actively, demonstrably malicious, seemingly using the HOA rules as a flimsy, pathetic shield for her deeply ingrained bigotry, and perhaps something even uglier. I took a deep, steadying breath, consciously, trying to rein in the torrent of white-hot fury that threatened to consume me, to make me say or do something I might later regret, professionally or personally. My professional training honed over years of high-stakes advocacy kicked in a cold, clear voice of reason and strategy, cutting through the emotional storm that raged within me. Karen, I said, my tone now deliberately devoid of the earlier maternal heat, replaced by an icy, lawyerly precision that I knew from experience could be far more intimidating. You have just committed an act of assault. Battery, to be precise. You have deliberately and intentionally caused significant emotional distress to a minor. A disabled minor, which I assure you carries additional weight under state law. I paused, letting the words hang in the suddenly very still air. And you have done so with clear, undeniable, and witnessed intent. A flicker of something, surprise, momentary uncertainty, perhaps even a tiny sliver of fear, crossed her usually impassive face, but it was quickly, almost instantly replaced by her habitual mask of haughty arrogance. Assault. Don't be utterly ridiculous, Sarah. It was a garden hose, a bit of water, hardly a lethal weapon, and I am well within my rights, indeed, my responsibility as an HOA member in good standing to uphold the established community standards. Community standards. Karen, I stated firmly, my gaze locking with hers, unwavering, do not, and never will include terrorizing children, destroying private property, or behaving like a deranged bully. You will be hearing from me, Karen, formally, and not just as your neighbor. Her smirk faltered visibly this time, a genuine crack in the facade. What's that supposed to mean? Are you threatening me? It means, I said, my voice still low, but carrying the undeniable weight of conviction and promise, that you have made a very, very serious mistake. A mistake I intend to ensure you fully comprehend. I then turned my back on her, a deliberate act of dismissal, and focused all my attention on Lily, on getting her inside, warm and safe, pushing aside the image of Karen's suddenly unsettled face. The battle lines had been drawn. The next few days were an agonizing blur of comforting a traumatized Lily, trying desperately to salvage some semblance of her ruined birthday, and initiating the first crucial steps of what I knew instinctively would be a difficult, protracted, and ugly battle. As I had feared, Lily developed a severe cold, which quickly escalated, bordering on pneumonia, a direct, undeniable result of the prolonged drenching and the profound shock to her system. Her doctor was furious, prescribing antibiotics and strict bed rest. Her fear of going outside, even into the perceived safety of our own backyard, the garden she had loved so much, was heartbreaking to witness. She had nightmares. She stopped drawing. The vibrant, outgoing, chatty little girl had retreated into a silent, watchful shell, her bright, inquisitive spirit dimmed, overshadowed by Karen's inexplicable, targeted cruelty. The HOA, predictably, was initially infuriatingly unhelpful. When I lodged a formal, detailed written complaint, complete with sworn statements from the other parents who had witnessed the entire horrifying event, and photographs of the damage, the response was lukewarm, almost dismissive. The board president, a pompous, self-important man named Arthur Jenkins, who seemed far more interested in maintaining the delicate, superficial status quo of Willow Creek Estates than in addressing actual serious grievances, particularly against a long-standing vocal member like Karen, actually suggested a mediation session. Perhaps there was merely a misunderstanding, Sarah, he'd said over the phone, his voice oozing a false, condescending sympathy that made my blood boil. Karen can be, shall we say, rather enthusiastic about the rules, but I'm truly sure she didn't mean any real lasting harm, a bit of an overreaction on her part, perhaps. Mr. Jenkins. I replied, my voice tight, strained with controlled, simmering anger. She intentionally, repeatedly, and aggressively soaked my disabled daughter with a high-pressure hose on her 10th birthday, causing her to become seriously ill and emotionally traumatized. There is no misunderstanding that can possibly excuse or mitigate that. I expect the HOA to take immediate, formal, and decisive action against Ms. Henderson for harassment, assault, endangerment of a child, and blatant violation of multiple decency and conduct clauses within your own bylaws. This isn't a he said, she said situation. It was witnessed by multiple adults. He hemmed and hawed a series of meaningless platitudes and vague promises to look into it thoroughly and confer with the other board members. But I knew it was a brush-off, a classic bureaucratic stall tactic. The HOA, as constituted, was a largely toothless, ineffective organization when it came to confronting one of its own, especially someone as entrenched, vocal, and litigious-sounding as Karen Henderson often portrayed herself to be. This was the second shocking, infuriating incident in the rapidly rising action. The very system that was supposed to protect residents to ensure peaceful enjoyment of their homes was in fact actively or passively enabling the aggressor. Karen, predictably emboldened by the HOA's glaring inaction, and Jenkins's weak response, which she undoubtedly heard about, escalated her insidious campaign of harassment. She began spreading vicious, slanderous rumors, posting thinly veiled poisonous accusations on the neighborhood's private online forum about disruptive, inconsiderate elements and certain families who simply don't respect community standards or the quiet enjoyment of others. She subtly, poisonously implied that Lily's disability was being exploited to garner undue sympathy and to deliberately flout the established rules. She even had the unmitigated gall, the sheer audacity, to submit a formal complaint against us for unapproved and abandoned party structures, referring to the sad, waterlogged remnants of Lily's ruined birthday decorations, which Mark, too heartsick and frankly too busy caring for Lily, had yet to completely clear away from the backyard. She would stand on her porch arms, crossed, and glare with open hostility whenever we were outside. Once, when I was carefully helping Lily into our specially adapted van for a follow-up doctor's appointment, Karen deliberately started her loud gasoline-powered lawnmower, aiming the stream of grass clippings and dust directly in our direction, a petty childish act of aggression that nonetheless made Lily flinch violently and cough. This wasn't just about HOA rules anymore, if it ever truly had been. This was deeply personal. This was a targeted, sustained campaign of harassment and intimidation designed to make our lives miserable. The profound, burning injustice of it all ate at me day and night. Here I was, Sarah Jennings, a respected county justice advocate, someone who navigated the labyrinthine, often frustrating corridors of the legal system to protect and defend others, and yet I felt utterly, frustratingly powerless to shield my own precious child from the insidious venom of one hateful, cruel woman in my own supposedly safe neighborhood. But that feeling of initial powerlessness I knew from long experience was a dangerous illusion. More importantly, it was the grit in the oyster, the spark that ignites the consuming fire of righteous action. Karen Henderson had profoundly, catastrophically underestimated me. She saw a distraught, emotional mother. She failed to see the seasoned, relentless advocate who knew precisely and legally how to dismantle bullies piece by painstaking piece. My private investigation into Karen Henderson began quietly, discreetly, methodically. I started by talking to other neighbors, not just about Lily's birthday incident, but about their past interactions, any notable encounters they'd had with Karen. I was careful framing my inquiries neutrally. A disturbing, undeniable pattern quickly, chillingly emerged. There was the family a few streets over the Lees who had been hounded relentlessly for months because their young autistic son sometimes made loud, joyful noises when playing in his yard. Karen had called Child Protective Services on them, alleging neglect. There was the elderly, recently widowed couple, the Garcias, who received almost weekly violation notices, complete with threatening letters for their slightly overgrown, beautiful rose bushes. Bushes their late spouse had lovingly tended for decades. There was the young, vibrant, interracial couple the Jacksons knew to the neighborhood, who were constantly being reported to the HOA, and even on one occasion to the local police for suspicious activity whenever they had guests over for dinner, particularly if their guests were also people of color. Karen's complaints, her venom, her upholding of standards, were almost always exclusively directed at those she perceived as different, as vulnerable, as not fitting into her narrow, prejudiced, and frighteningly homogeneous worldview. Then came the first crucial layer of the midpoint twist, the kind of discovery that makes an investigator's heart beat a little faster. While meticulously reviewing publicly accessible county property records online, a skill honed by years of investigating complex housing discrimination and redlining cases, I stumbled upon something distinctly interesting, an anomaly that pinged my professional radar. Karen Henderson, I discovered, was not just a vocal HOA member. She was currently serving on the HOA's powerful Architectural Review Committee, a position that gave her considerable, often unchecked sway over approvals for any home renovations additions and even significant landscaping changes. Digging deeper, cross-referencing names and dates, I found a series of strangely timed, slightly rushed property sales within our specific Willow Creek Estates neighborhood over the past 5 years. Several homes, whose previous owners I later learned through careful, discreet inquiries, had been subjected to sustained documented campaigns of harassment by Karen, often involving repeated escalating HOA violations and hefty fines, had eventually sold. And they had sold tellingly at prices slightly, but consistently below prevailing market value. And the buyer in 3 of these eyebrow-raising instances was the same nondescript, generically named limited liability company, Willow Creek Future Holdings, LLC. An LLC whose registered agent, a quick search of state business records revealed, was a man named Martin Henderson. Karen Henderson's cousin, a small-time, somewhat notorious real estate developer based in the city, known for aggressive acquisition tactics. The disparate pieces clicked into place with a sickening cold thud of realization. This wasn't just about petty tyranny, or an obsessive personality, or even simple garden variety prejudice, as ugly as those things were. This was potentially about something far more calculated, far more insidious, a deliberate systematic campaign to harass and drive certain, perhaps more vulnerable or less financially secure residents out of their homes. To depress property values in specific pockets of the neighborhood and then facilitate acquisitions for her cousin's development company at below market rates. Were they planning to tear down older, smaller homes and build larger, more expensive modern monstrosities, effectively gentrifying the neighborhood from within, all under the cynical, hypocritical guise of upholding community standards and improving property values for a select few? The sheer cold-blooded cynicism of it was chilling. Lily's ruined birthday, the targeted drenching, the subsequent harassment. It might have been for Karen just another Tuesday, another calculated step in a larger, more nefarious, and ultimately profitable game. The rage I felt was cold, now laser-focused, precise. This discovery transformed the entire situation, elevating it far beyond a personal grievance. It was no longer just a mother's fight for her child's dignity and safety. It was rapidly becoming a matter of significant public interest, potentially involving conspiracy housing fraud and discriminatory practices that fell squarely within the purview of my office, or at the very least, gave me significantly stronger leverage and a much wider array of legal tools. I needed more than just strong suspicion and circumstantial evidence, however compelling it seemed. I needed concrete, irrefutable proof of intent and coordination. And that's when the second, even more explosive layer of the twist unfolded quite unexpectedly, delivered to my doorstep. One evening, about a week after my discovery of the LLC connection, there was a hesitant, almost timid knock on our front door. It was Mr. Peterson, an elderly, gentle widower, who lived on the next street over. He was a quiet, reserved man, someone who usually kept very much to himself, rarely seen at neighborhood gatherings. He looked visibly nervous, his frail hands clutching a worn, bulging manila envelope to his chest. "Mrs. Jennings." He began, his voice trembling slightly, his eyes darting around as if fearing he'd been followed. I heard about what happened to your little girl at her party. And I've heard some of the awful things Karen Henderson has been saying about you and your family on that internet page." He took a shaky breath. I think I might have something that could help you. Something you need to see and hear." He explained, his voice gaining a little strength as he spoke, that Karen had hounded him relentlessly, mercilessly, for over a year about the state of his late wife's cherished memorial garden. She'd called it an eyesore, a weed patch, a detriment to the neighborhood, threatening him with daily escalating fines and even legal action from the HOA. He'd been on the verge of selling his home of 40 years, feeling utterly defeated, isolated, and overwhelmed, when his visiting son, a tech-savvy young man with a strong sense of justice, had suggested installing discreet, high-quality security cameras with audio recording capabilities around his property. Ostensibly for general security, but also, his son had admitted, to hopefully document Karen's escalating harassment. The manila envelope, he explained, contained a USB drive. "She used to come onto my property, Mrs. Jennings, trespassing, when she thought I wasn't home or when I was out for my appointments," he said, his voice now laced with a quiet, dignified anger. She'd damage the plants, my Mary's roses, and she'd talk to herself sometimes, or often she'd be on the phone pacing back and forth right by my living room window. That night, Mark and I sat in stunned, horrified silence in our darkened living room as we listened to the audio recordings and watched the accompanying video footage. There were hours of it meticulously cataloged by Mr. Peterson's son, but certain clips, certain damning segments stood out with horrifying clarity. Karen muttering viciously to herself as she deliberately, stealthily snapped the heads off Mr. Peterson's prize-winning vibrant yellow roses, his late wife's favorite. Karen on the phone with an unknown person, laughing a harsh, cruel sound as she described in detail how that stubborn old fool Peterson will be out by Christmas, mark my words. And then we can finally make a decent offer on that dump. And then the absolute jackpot, a crystal clear, lengthy phone conversation, her face visible on the video as she paced by Mr. Peterson's window, clearly with her cousin Martin Henderson. In it, they were outlining their entire predatory strategy. Just keep up the relentless pressure with the HOA violations. Karen Martin's voice, tinny but discernible, instructed, "We need at least 3 more on that particular block to make the numbers work for the rezoning application with the city. The one with the disabled kid. That mother, Sarah Jennings, she seems like a real fighter, a troublemaker. We might need to be a bit more persuasive with her. Discourage her from digging in." Persuasive. That's what drenching Lily, my vulnerable child with a hose on her birthday, was. An act of persuasion, a tactic to discourage me. The sheer calculated evil of it took my breath away. The recordings were a bombshell, an absolute game changer. They provided undeniable, irrefutable evidence of Karen's malicious intent, her premeditated harassment, her clear conspiracy with her cousin, and the cold, hard financial motive behind her reign of terror in Willow Creek Estates. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore, not by a long shot. This was potentially criminal. Conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, fair housing violations, stalking. A whole host of serious charges. Armed with this new explosive evidence, my strategy shifted, becoming sharper, more aggressive. I wasn't just going to fight Karen over Lily's ruined birthday and the subsequent harassment. I was going to expose her entire sordid, predatory scheme. I consulted carefully with my most trusted senior colleagues at the County Justice Advocate's office, ensuring I maintained all ethical boundaries, given my deep personal involvement, but also leveraging their collective expertise and resources. We determined that Karen's actions and those of her cousin constituted a clear pattern of systematic harassment, intimidation, and potentially conspiracy to commit wire and mail fraud alongside egregious violations of state and federal fair housing laws due to the clearly targeted nature of her complaints against protected classes, the disabled, racial minorities, the elderly. The climax was building not towards a simple internal HOA disciplinary hearing, which I knew would be woefully inadequate, but towards something much larger, much more public, and with far more severe consequences for Karen. I formally requested a special emergency meeting with the full HOA board. But this time, I informed them in no uncertain terms via certified mail and email to each board member that representatives from the County Fair Housing Office, an investigator from the District Attorney's Economic Crimes Unit, and a senior attorney from my own office. The County Justice Advocate would also be in attendance as official observers, given the extreme severity of the allegations and the potential for significant legal action against the HOA itself if they failed to act decisively and appropriately to address the documented wrongdoing. That, as expected, got their immediate undivided attention. Arthur Jenkins called me within an hour, his voice suddenly devoid of its earlier condescension, replaced by a distinct tone of panic. The meeting was held in the sterile, impersonal community clubhouse, a room usually reserved for sparsely attended monthly meetings and holiday potlucks. That evening, however, it felt charged with an almost unbearable crackling tension. Karen was there, of course. Initially, she looked surprisingly confident, even smug, a defiant tilt to her chin. She likely believed this was just another opportunity to assert her dominance, to spin her narrative, perhaps even to paint herself as the victim of a neighborhood vendetta. She was wrong. Mr. Peterson, looking frail but resolute, sat with Mark and me at a table near the front. His son was beside him. Several other neighbors passed, and current victims of Karen's insidious tactics, people I had discreetly contacted and who had bravely agreed to speak, were also present, their faces grim, determined. The HOA president, Arthur Jenkins, looking pale and sweating profusely, despite the cool air conditioning, opened the meeting with his usual rambling platitudes about community harmony and resolving differences amicably. His nervousness, however, was palpable, his hands shaking as he shuffled his papers. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply calmly and methodically laid out the facts, presenting a detailed documented timeline of Karen's escalating harassment against my family, culminating in the vicious assault on Lily. I described the impact on Lily, her illness, her fear, her lost joy. Then, with the board's reluctant permission, I played a short, carefully selected, but utterly damning audio clip from Mr. Peterson's recordings, the one where Karen and her cousins specifically discussed being persuasive with my family, the family with the disabled kid. The color drained instantly from Karen's face. Her smugness evaporated, as if it had never been replaced by a sickly, greenish pallor. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. Then I broadened the scope of my presentation. I presented the meticulously compiled evidence of her systematic predatory targeting of other vulnerable residents, the Lees, the Garcias, the Jacksons, and others. I detailed the suspicious property sales, her direct familial and professional connection to the Development LLC Willow Creek Future Holdings. I calmly, clearly outlined the potential severe legal ramifications for her and her cousin, criminal charges for harassment and stalking civil lawsuits, for massive emotional distress penalties, significant fines for civil rights violations under fair housing laws, and a full-scale investigation by state and federal authorities into fraudulent and predatory real estate practices. I made it crystal clear, looking directly at each board member, that this was no longer just about neighborhood squabbles or petty rule enforcement. This was about confronting systemic abuse, corruption, and ensuring justice for all targeted residents. "Ms. Henderson," I said, my gaze fixed on her, my voice steady and unwavering. "Your actions, your calculated cruelty, have caused significant lasting harm, not just to my daughter Lily, but to this entire community. You have cynically weaponized HOA rules, not to uphold standards, but to systematically harass, intimidate, and defraud residents, seemingly for personal and significant financial gain in concert with your cousin. This pattern of behavior is not only morally reprehensible, it is unequivocally illegal, and it stops now." Karen attempted to bluster to deny her voice, suddenly high-pitched and shaky. "This is outrageous slander. These are lies, all lies. You're twisting things. I was only trying to protect our neighborhood." She looked wildly around the room as if seeking an ally, but found only cold, condemnatory stares. Her carefully constructed facade of righteous indignation was crumbling before our eyes, revealing the panicked, malevolent individual beneath. Her lawyer, a man I recognized from previous unrelated cases as a bottom feeder, tried to interject, citing procedural irregularities, but he was curtly silenced by the representative from the DA's office. But Karen's voice lacked any of its usual conviction. The evidence was too compelling, too overwhelming. The pointed presence of county and DA officials was too intimidating. Mr. Peterson then stood, his voice shaking, but clear and strong, and described his own harrowing ordeal, his words painting a vivid, heartbreaking picture of Karen's sustained cruelty and its devastating impact on his life after his wife's passing. One by one, other neighbors, Mrs. Lee, Mr. Jackson, Mrs. Garcia's son, stood and shared their own painful stories, a chorus of voices long silenced by fear or intimidation, finally rising against years of bullying, harassment, and discrimination. It was powerful, moving, and utterly damning for Karen. The HOA board, faced with the irrefutable, multi-layered evidence, the testimonies of multiple victims, and the implicit looming threat of serious county and state intervention and potential lawsuits against the HOA itself for gross negligence, was finally decisively forced to act. Karen's position on the Architectural Review Committee was immediately and unanimously suspended. They voted again unanimously to issue a formal public censure of Karen Henderson, and to initiate immediate proceedings to remove her from the HOA board entirely if such a mechanism existed within their convoluted bylaws. If not, they pledged to explore all available legal avenues to permanently limit her influence and ability to harass other residents. Arthur Jenkins looked like he wanted to disappear. But my fight, our fight, wasn't just with the HOA. That was merely the first necessary step. The following actions saw the swift, decisive initiation of multiple external legal proceedings. I immediately filed for, and was quickly granted, a permanent restraining order against Karen Henderson on behalf of Lily, myself, and Mark, prohibiting her from any contact and requiring her to stay a significant distance from our persons and our property. The local police, now armed with the damning evidence from Mr. Peterson's recordings and sworn statements from multiple families, officially opened a criminal investigation into Karen Henderson for felony, stalking, harassment, and conspiracy. The County Fair Housing Office launched its own comprehensive investigation into both Karen and her cousin Martin's real estate dealings in Willow Creek and surrounding areas, specifically looking for patterns of housing discrimination and predatory acquisition practices against protected classes. The civil lawsuit for emotional distress damages filed on Lily's behalf proceeded through the courts. The impact on Lily, her documented illness, her profound fear, her recurring nightmares, her reluctance to engage in her beloved art, was central to this. A respected child psychologist provided expert testimony on the significant trauma Lily had experienced and the long-term psychological support she would require. The court, in its ruling, unequivocally recognized the severity, malice, and targeted nature of Karen's actions, especially given Lily's documented medical vulnerability. The resolution, when it finally came after many months, was multifaceted, comprehensive, and deeply, profoundly satisfying. Karen Henderson was found liable for substantial emotional distress damages in the civil suit. The monetary award was significant enough to serve as a serious financial deterrent to her and others, and more importantly, as a tangible measure of justice and validation for Lily. The ongoing criminal investigation into harassment and stalking led to felony charges being filed. While Karen ultimately avoided jail time through a plea bargain vigorously opposed by me, but accepted by the DA to spare victims further trial trauma, she was convicted of lesser-included offenses. She was sentenced to extensive court-mandated community service, mandatory intensive anger management and anti-bias training, and a lengthy, strictly supervised probation period during which any further HOA complaints or similar actions from her would be subject to immediate and severe penalties, including potential incarceration. Her cousin Martin's LLC Willow Creek Future Holdings came under intense investigation by state regulatory authorities for fraudulent business practices. While that complex legal process would be much longer, their predatory plans for Willow Creek Estates were effectively and permanently scuttled. He too faced legal repercussions. The HOA, shaken to its very core by the scandal and the near miss with significant legal liability, underwent a period of painful but necessary reform. New, more compassionate and community-minded leadership was elected. The voluminous, often contradictory bylaws were thoroughly reviewed and extensively revised by outside legal counsel to prevent the kind of systemic abuse Karen had so adeptly perpetrated. A new emphasis was placed on transparency, due process, inclusivity, and genuine community well-being rather than arbitrary punitive rule enforcement. They even organized a neighborhood-wide fundraiser not only to help cover Lily's outstanding medical bills, but also to make a substantial contribution in her name to a local charity supporting disabled children and their families, a gesture that spoke volumes about the profound shift in the community's consciousness and values. For Lily, the healing was a gradual, gentle process. We threw her another much-belated 10th birthday party, a smaller, quieter, more intimate affair with her closest, most supportive friends, held in the cherished safety and warmth of our home. The community, now fully aware of the true extent of Karen's malice and predatory scheming, showered Lily with genuine, heartfelt support. Cards, small, thoughtful gifts, and countless words of encouragement poured in from neighbors, many of whom we barely knew before. Slowly, painstakingly, her radiant smile returned her natural, joyful effervescence, re-emerging like sunshine after a long storm. She started venturing into the backyard again, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. She began to draw again, her sketchbooks filling with bright colors, fantastical creatures, and of course, beautiful, intricate castles, stronger and more resilient than before. Her dream of becoming an artist burned brighter than ever. The children on the street, once wary, now included her more actively in their games, adapting their play to ensure she could participate, often gathering around her as she sketched on the driveway, offering suggestions for her drawings. The ordeal changed our family undoubtedly. It left scars, emotional and psychological, that would take time to fully fade. But it also forged an even stronger, more unbreakable bond between us. It reminded me in the most visceral way possible of the profound personal importance of my work, not as an abstract legal concept, but as a vital, tangible shield for the vulnerable, including and especially those closest to my own heart. The fight had been intensely personal, born of a mother's protective rage. But the victory, the healing was shared, rippling outwards through our community. Our street, our neighborhood felt different, lighter. The air seemed cleaner, the silences more peaceful, the laughter of children, all children, ringing out with a newfound freedom and joy. Karen Henderson's reign of petty, poisonous tyranny was well and truly over. She sold her house under duress from the ongoing legal and financial pressures and moved away quietly, unlamented, disappearing from Willow Creek Estates for good. Her departure was replaced by a community more aware, more compassionate, more vigilant, and more united against injustice in any form. And Lily, my brave, beautiful, resilient Lily, was finally truly able to just be a child again, her indomitable spirit, though severely tested, ultimately unbroken, her future, bright and full of boundless promise. The chilling echoes of that harsh, cold spray would eventually fade into a distant cautionary memory, but the warmth of a community standing together, choosing courage over complacency and justice over injustice, would resonate for a long, long, hopeful time to come. The fight for justice. I was reminded often begins in the most unexpected, most personal of places, even in one's own backyard, and its impact, its ripples of change can extend outwards, bringing much-needed light, healing, and hope to the darkest, most forgotten corners.